Rick, I'll miss you most of all.
The Wizard of Oz has been seen by more people, more times, than any other film in the history of cinema.
Are you ready now?
You can't tear yourself away from it. And that's the power of a good narrative.
Millions more have read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book on which the film was based.
It's no exaggeration to say that Oz and Oz books were the Harry Potter books of their day.
The story has come to define America to Americans and America to the world.
Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are...
But less well known is that this fairy tale, written by the American author L. Frank Baum, was inspired by a true story, his own. So many of the themes that are so universal and so timeless of the book, and therefore of the film, had their roots in a real man's life and a real man's experiences.
I think Baum identified with the wizard himself. I think he thought of himself as a bit of a humbug, that, that everybody was expecting him to do all these marvelous things, and he was just a man.
Frank Baum created a fantasy world which was grounded in reality and set in the America of his day. The Emerald City was based on an actual place and time, a real twister that took a house for a ride. And Dorothy, the first feminist in children's literature, was inspired by the women in Baum's life.
It's about American politics and American dreams and hopes and American pluck.
Frank Baum may have thought of himself as a humbug, but in his later books, the wizard learns the art of magic and becomes a wizard after all. This film tells the intriguing story of how the man behind the wizard came to write about his journey and created the first genuine American fairy tale.
Yes. Say goodbye, Toto. Yes, I'm ready now. Then close your eyes and tap your heels together 3 times.
The ruby slippers in the movie The Wizard of Oz are probably the most famous shoes in the world. MGM's costume designers made a number of pairs for Judy Garland, the 15-year-old actress who played Dorothy in the film. And every year at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., these 70-year-old slippers attract millions of visitors.
They seem to have an enormous resonance with them. It seems to increase in generations. Not only does it mean something to the generation who lived through when these objects were new, they're sharing with their children, and we're seeing a transference of value.
The ruby slippers and other artifacts in the museum's Oz movie collection are much more than tourist attractions. They are icons of American popular culture and are handled with great care to protect and preserve them for future generations.
We have become more and more aware of the heritage that we have created with our entertainment industry, and those things have a strong emotional connection.
Today, The Wizard of Oz is more than a book, more than a movie or a Broadway play. It's hard to imagine a world without it. When Dorothy says, "I just want to go home," it just makes me want to cry. And then she realized she is home.
Of all the themes, having a heart or having a brain, being courageous or being afraid is the thing that universally goes deepest, I think, into an audience's heart.
To understand what inspired Frank Baum's story about an old fraud who became a wizard and Dorothy and her 4 companions who believed he could help them, it's best to start at the beginning. In the small town of Chittenango in central New York, where Frank Baum was born in 1856.
L. Frank Baum grew up in a house of women. He had 2 older sisters. He had, his mother was evidently a very strong character as well. His father wasn't at home a lot.
His father was in the oil business, in the land business, in the banking business, whatever was going on.
The Baum family lived at Rose Lawn, a rambling house surrounded by acres of flower beds and fields. Like many well-to-do families, the Baum children were homeschooled by English tutors.
I don't know what they did when he was younger, if they were more formal in teaching him to read and write. He makes up all kinds of silly words. You know, not only does he do puns and play with English language, but he makes up his own. It's how Oz came to be, you know, looking around at the file cabinet and O to Z, and now it's a word.
Given to daydreaming, Frank's parents sent him to Peekskill Military Academy at the age of 10 to instill discipline. After 2 unhappy years, he returned home to resume an idyllic childhood and experiences that would later find their way into his books.
He and his brothers could go out in the fields and the mountains and the valleys and so forth and just let their imagination roam. And he saw a lot of the different things around him. Scarecrow in particular, one episode he supposedly got pretty scared by one, and it stuck with him.
Years later, Frank would confront the object of his fear by creating a scarecrow who has feelings but cannot think, a character whose goal was to obtain what he lacked.
He wanted to have a brain. He wanted to improve his circumstances. No matter what anyone says, you know, a scarecrow is not supposed to have a brain. He's going out and get a brain.
The determination to achieve goals was not confined to the characters in Oz. Even at 15, their creator was determined to see his words in print.
He goes on a trip with his dad to town, sees a printing press, is intrigued with that, and his dad buys him a little printing press.
Well, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, amateur journalism was all the rage. Young men, young women, were able to purchase a cheap printing press, and they issued all these little newspapers that they exchanged with one another, and they talked about each other in these newspapers. And L. Frank Baum was one of the first of these.
Communicating was important to Frank, but also was the technology that facilitated it. His lifelong fascination with science and its application produced prophetic, futuristic inventions, which featured in all 60 of the books he wrote.
You see it with Glinda in her magic book. She reads in the book what's happening as it's going on. Now, we do that now with computers. We turn on the computer, we turn on the news, we see what's happening right now.
Frank Baum was a born storyteller in search of an audience. Writing and performing for the stage fulfilled his aim.
Baum loved theater. He grew up loving acting and writing for the stage, composing songs for the stage. He started doing this in his teens and in his 20s and was doing it very successfully for a while.
He wrote the scripts, and then he directed the scripts, and then he produced the plays, and his parents were sort of appalled at all this, but his parents supported his artistic endeavors.
Benjamin Baum invested in a theater company and venues where his son could stage his plays. The Maid of Arran, described as an Irish melodrama with music, was Frank's first success. But it wouldn't be long before disaster struck.
Dad owned a lot of the theaters and, helped pay the bills, and until, of course, the theaters burned down.
Frank didn't dwell on this setback. He had other things on his mind. He was in love with Maud Gage, a 20-year-old college student whose mother was one of the leading campaigners for women's rights. Matilda Gage disapproved of actors, but her daughter, equally strong-minded, was determined to marry Frank.
Everybody talks about how strong their love was from the very beginning, and I think they really appreciated and supported each other and the role that they played in each other's lives.
In 1888, after the birth of their second child, it was Frank's turn to support his wife, and they moved to the Dakota Territory so that Maud could be near her family. In the frontier town of Aberdeen, where the Baum settled, Frank found a rich source of inspiration for characters and the landscapes where the wonderful Wizard of Oz begins.
In Chapter 1 about Kansas, Baum uses the word gray 9 times to refer to the grass, to the sky, to the way the paint is peeled off the building, the way Aunt Em and Uncle Henry are old and worn and gray from the basic drought that is going on at the beginning of that story.
It just seems like L. Frank Baum is creating this whole new universe, almost out of whole cloth. And then the more you learn about him and about the period, there do seem to be connections between Oz and what was going on at the time.
There's a storm blowing up, a whopper. To speak in the vernacular of the peasantry, Poor little kid. I hope she gets home all right.
Some of it's as simple as like Kansas being where the tornadoes or the cyclones are from, and Kansas also being right in the center of the United States.
South Dakota wasn't Kansas, nor was it the center of America, but Aberdeen was the hub for 7 train lines, and it looked set to boom. The streets may have been unpaved, but there were street lights. The only telephones west of New York, an opera house, and ladies' reading groups, but appearances were deceptive.
Just looking at it fairly broadly, the last quarter century, from about 1875 to 1900, as a time of incredible prosperity, the age of big business where America became a first-rank industrial power. But farmers were kind of being left behind by a lot of this. A lot of individual farmers were really going under.
In The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and her companions travel to the Emerald City, believing that their dreams would be fulfilled. The lesson Frank Baum was about to learn was that believing in dreams doesn't always make them come true.
He saw the promise. What he didn't see at that time, I believe, was the fact that they'd had a very bad crop. And so by the time Baum came in 1888, the boom was over. They just didn't all know it yet.
Despite the warnings of an economic crash, Frank opened Baum's Bazaar selling luxury goods. Business started well, and he and Maud were soon welcomed in Aberdeen society.
He was very charismatic. He was very funny. He liked to engage people. They were very civic-minded. They were very involved with the community, and people liked them.
Aberdeen's social life was exceedingly rich, and he took full advantage of it. He loved it. He loved a good play or a good musical. He was in several of them.
In 1890, after 3 years of drought, an acre of land that once produced 20 bushels of wheat now yielded only 4. Consequences for farmers affected everyone in the community.
Everything they owned was in hock. They owed money on it. They couldn't even, the only way they could leave was to walk out. It's comparable in some ways to the real estate bust or the mortgage bust that we're experiencing or have been experiencing in the last couple of years.
Baum's Bazaar and other businesses were forced to close. But instead of returning east as others were doing, Frank followed in the footsteps of Mark Twain and other American authors who built their reputations by writing for newspapers in the West. He bought the Dakota Pioneer, changed its name to the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, and made it uniquely his own.
The newspaper just sparkles from the very beginning. It's an illustrated newspaper for that time period in that place.
I went back and read all his editorials in the newspaper, which were, one of the few places he wrote for adults. And it was fascinating. There was a tornado that came through, and it lifted a house and dropped it 2 miles away. And he wrote about that for about 2 weeks. He'd write, and then he'd come back to it, and he'd talk about it again, and then he'd come back to it and talk about it again. I think he was absolutely intrigued that could happen. So you see some of the imagery that developed in the story.
50 years later, that imagery would be recreated in Hollywood's version of Frank Baum's story. Only the cyclone would be recreated with a muslin stocking attached to a car. But in the world of the 1890s, Frank Baum was caught up in the whirlwind of another kind, which he wrote about in his editorials and a satirical column he called Our Landlady.
There was an incredible progression of ideas that were bursting out on the plains at that time. You had women's suffrage. There was first big women's suffrage campaign in South Dakota took place.
Leading women's rights campaigners gathered in South Dakota to lobby lawmakers for the right to vote. Matilda Gage, Frank's mother-in-law, was one of them. With most of her family now living in the Dakota Territory, Mrs. Gage moved next door to Frank and Maud.
He and Mother Gage, as we sometimes call her, I think they got along and I think they respected each other, and I'm sure it did have some influence.
women were getting to the point where they were starting to come out more and find their voice. And men were beginning to connect more with their nurturing side. And he was a big supporter of women getting out into the marketplace and men connecting more with the children and spending time at home.
It was the model in the Baum household, and it led to Frank writing about women's rights more than any other issue. From childhood, he believed women were equal to men, but it was the women struggling to survive on the high plains who would provide inspiration for Dorothy, his gutsy heroine, in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Well, Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz is probably the first important child character in American children's literature. Dorothy is really the first feminist role model. She's typical Midwesterner. She goes out, she solves her problems, and then comes home again.
I think a lot of children and adults resonate with the character of someone on a quest to find what really matters in life. And that's what the piece is all about.
Dorothy is tough and brave and independent, and she's really a child version of the pioneer woman who went out in the covered wagon and worked side by side with her husband to establish a farm and raise a family.
I think if the book came out now, they'd have Dorothy kicking butt.
In The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch sends wolves, crows, and bees to frighten Dorothy and her friends. These pests were a real problem for farmers on the prairies, but by 1891, farmers' greatest fears were from foreclosure and an Indian uprising that never happened, but a threat that drove more settlers out of the West, many who had subscribed to the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer. Loss of revenue and subscriptions forced Frank to publish his last edition on the 8th of February, 1891.
He came out with such high expectations as a storekeeper in the beginning. He took that same enthusiasm when he moved to the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer. And those hopes were dashed twice. I mean, they were just thoroughly throttled.
In 1891, Frank Baum embarked upon a journey that would bring him to a magical place he would write about. Chicago and its White City, which would be the venue for the largest World's Fair ever held when it opened in 1893. But for now, he needed to find work.
From what I understand, when he first started out, he would try anything, work for Pitkin and Brooks, selling crockery.
The Tin Man, one of Dorothy's companions, was born during Frank Baum's career selling china and his accidental career designing shop windows.
He started a whole magazine about window decorating. When he went on the road after Aberdeen and was selling crockery, he would go into these retail stores where they had in their windows boxes of stuff. And he said, let's design it. And he, that presumably is where the Tin Woodman came from. Took a pie pen, took a funnel, made this character of a man out of tin, stuck it in the window, designed the windows so they'd be attractive to people and people would want to come in and buy the products.
Frank Baum's enthusiasm for new projects took its toll, and doctors ordered him to rest.
His health wouldn't let him keep traveling, so then he started writing. So I think it was all part of that, getting him to the place where he really said, okay, I'm just going to write stories now.
When the Chicago World's Fair opened, Frank got all the inspiration he needed. He and half the country's population came and were amazed by what they saw. Electricity powering lights which made magnificent structures sparkle like diamonds. The first Ferris wheel, which towered 264 feet high. And the prototype for a motion picture camera that Frank dreamt of using himself one day.
He was fascinated about so many different things. I mean, he loved photography, he was into science, as much as he could be in those days when he went to the World's Fair. I mean, electricity fascinated him. So I think there was just a fascination for the world around him.
The spirit and substance of the fair found their way into the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Frank recognized that this grand white city built of wood but painted like marble was a fabulous fake. A grand illusion like the Emerald City he would build, as a way of showing how appearances can deceive. A theme running through The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, set in a plot which, like all fairy tales, reveals that good will triumph over evil.
I think this is what he also felt with his own life. Things would always get better, that he would eventually triumph over all the stumbling blocks throughout his life.
For America, the fair was a great source of wonder and national pride. But for Frank Baum, it represented the beginning of the most magical and exciting chapter of his life.
The turn of the century was rich with all of the creative impact that was happening. I'm sure he heard Thomas Edison at the World's Fair he went to in Chicago and got intrigued with film. He was a big fan of the imagination. He talks about that, how important it is to be able to imagine something, and that gives it the possibility of coming into material form.
In The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and her companions used their imagination and ingenuity, just as Frank Baum would do after the fair closed.
You know, Maud complained about it, his wife. He would wake up in the middle of the night and he'd get ideas about things to do, and he'd write on the wallpaper. And she was just furious because she had to keep changing the wallpaper.
By 1898, after a series of rejections from publishers, Frank Baum decided to produce his own book, a book of poems. By the Candelabra's Glare proved to be the best investment Frank Baum had ever made in himself. It soon led to his first book deal.
He used to tell stories to his children, bedtime stories, and he also told stories based upon Mother Goose rhymes.
Wee Willie Winkie runs through the town, upstairs, downstairs, in his nightgown, rapping on the windows, crying through the locks. Are the children in their bed? It's the o'clock. I taught that to my daughter when she was 3 years old. And she could recite it, and people thought that was remarkable. But that's what people used to do.
This became his very first book, Mother Goose in Prose. And it was also the very first book illustrated by Maxwell Parrish, one of the great American illustrators.
Good reviews for Mother Goose were all the encouragement Frank needed. Now he turned to William Wallace Denslow, one of the illustrators for By the Candelabra's Glare. They formed a unique partnership and together would change children's publishing in America forever, beginning with their first book, Father Goose.
It was a series of Mother Goose-like jingles, thus the Father Goose title. And they were illustrated by Denslow in very lush poster-like illustrations with the verse hand-lettered incorporated into the illustration.
The two of them wanted the book to be published in color. They went to a printer who said that he would publish the book, but only if they paid for the color plates, because they were so expensive to produce.
This book was a huge hit, so the public, at least the book-buying public, was waiting for the next Baum and Denslow collaboration.
Encouraged by this success, Frank came up with an original story that developed as he told it to his children.
His wife and his mother-in-law were there, and they said, listen, you need to write this story down. This is a great story.
The story was called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and the first edition quickly sold out to become America's first publishing sensation.
It's no exaggeration to say that Oz and Oz books were the Harry Potter books of their day, and it's even more impressive when you look back at what there wasn't in the last century. They didn't have this huge churning promotional machine. The Oz books, it was a word-of-mouth, read aloud fascination that kids just never tired of.
Parents were drawn to the volume as well. They had never seen anything like it before.
Baum and Denslow did plan the book to be an object as much as the experience of the story. It's a beautiful object in and of itself. The careful color choices, the integration of the text with the illustrations. Of course, Baum's text makes great use of color within the story.
Denslow's illustrations were drawn in black and white. Then he worked with printers to add color.
I've heard of kids who, when they watch the movie, they're really scared of the witch or the winged monkeys or other aspects. But the book there's always humor in it. The witch in the books looks very funny. The The Denslow illustrations of the witch are quite humorous. She's this little old lady with a raincoat and an eye patch and 3 braids sticking out of her head at bizarre angles.
Denslow's artwork drew children into The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but it was Baum's story that kept them there. Together they produced only one other book, and William Denslow went on to write and illustrate stories featuring the Scarecrow and other characters he created. Frank Baum wrote 13 more books set in Oz. Only these would be illustrated by John R. Neal, whose style couldn't have been more different.
Denslow obviously was influenced by the poster movement in the late 19th century, the design, the flat shapes, the solid colors, the use of very little perspective. That's all evident in his work. John R. Neal, on the other hand, was much more influenced by magazine and newspaper illustration.
Neal's drawings transformed Dorothy. She was older, more sophisticated, and wore fashions of the day. Today, others, like artist Eric Schanauer, create their own versions of the characters from Oz.
I love drawing the Scarecrow simply because he is such a malleable character, and it's fun to draw his limbs twisting in odd directions. Sometimes I have to draw an Oz character that I'd never drawn before because it's required for a story. If it's an established character, I have to go back to the Oz books, either the illustrations by John R. Neal or by W. Denslow, and see what they've done. And I usually stick pretty close to the design, but I always try to make a character an Oz character my own.
The thing that I find interesting is that recently, a number of generations have created their own Wizard of Oz, which means that the story has enormous resonance with a vast audience, whether it is The Wiz, the sort of Caribbeanized version of the story, or right now, Wicked.
Baum's original characters were well conceived, so believable that interpretations by every generation since they were created have not lessened their appeal.
I would never have found it if it hadn't been for you.
I think it's certainly true that it's the characterization that made this book popular. One of the things, these are immediately lovable and interesting characters, and they all have their own specialty, and they're all real and alive. It's possible for people to see themselves as being a cowardly lion or a scarecrow, or, of course, for children to identify with Dorothy.
The lion, scarecrow, and Tin Woodman want to ask the wizard for courage, a brain, and a heart. Frank Baum asked his readers to consider how these qualities appear and what they really are. But the masterstroke is to let the characters' actions speak for them.
Dorothy loses her temper, she throws the bucket of water at the Wicked Witch, and then she's just washed away. L. Frank Baum creates such a easy way of getting rid of the Wicked Witch. She just melts, and Dorothy just sweeps it out the door, just gets rid of the last bit of the Wicked Witch, and then everybody is happy.
Children's literature that features protagonists that are children that overcome obstacles and confront fear, those are the best.
Why, I met the Wizard of Oz.
Allowing a child to express emotions without fear of censure was a breakthrough in American children's literature.
Well, I think one of the greatly attractive things about the story is that a child character, a powerless character, through no fault of its own, using only what little power that child may have, achieves a great amount and becomes powerful by the end.
Children embraced Baum's books, but some adults did not. There was an unofficial ban of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by many children's libraries, but that didn't affect sales.
These books were selling and kids were going crazy, and Baum wrote a book a year, and then he tried to cut off Oz after 6 books because he was tired of it. But nothing else he wrote had that appeal, and if he wanted to support himself financially, he, after 2 years, went back to Oz.
In 1902, Frank Baum's Wonderful Wizard of Oz was licensed for a theatrical production, an extravaganza. It would be the first of many versions over the years, including Frank's own, which he called a fairy log.
which was the same thing as a travelogue. Instead of going to China or Japan, he went to the Land of Oz. He was not happy with the conventional. He wanted everything. He wanted to change things. He believed in the concept of progress.
Frank Baum was ahead of his time with a multimedia production, but he paid the price for innovation. The execution of his ideas was expensive and would lead to bankruptcy in 1911, but by then Frank Baum believed he had arrived in the Land of Oz.
Baum always moved on. He never looked back. He left New York State, went to South Dakota, then he went to Chicago, then he went to Hollywood, California. He was always looking for new opportunities.
The Baums moved to California to start over. Using money from Maud's inheritance, they bought land in what once was an orange grove. They called their new home Oscott, and the orange grove became known as Hollywood.
He suddenly realized there was this whole film industry growing up around him, and he contacted a number of friends.
Baum's new group of friends were already financing film projects based on other literary works. All Frank had to do was convince them to back his. The phenomenal success of his books and the extravaganza made it an easy sell.
Baum thought he could create his own film company producing his Oz books, and so he formed the Oz Manufacturing Company.
In 1914, Frank Baum was president and chief scriptwriter of the Oz Film Manufacturing Company. He set out to conquer Hollywood, making films for a family audience, and presided over the production of 5 films in all.
These were not your usual kind of motion pictures because they all had an original score with them. Enormously expensive. Unfortunately, they were not successful.
With war in Europe affecting book sales and his income greatly reduced, Frank worked even harder to make the company a success. But for the first time in his life, he was forced to accept that there were obstacles not even he could overcome.
And it had to stop. He was getting sick at the end of his life, and big film industry came along and started making talking movies, and he wasn't equipped to compete with all of that.
The Oz Film Company closed. This failure was the last Frank Baum would experience. By 1918, his health was failing, but despite constant pain, the self-proclaimed royal historian of Oz did not give up hope or his work.
He was pretty much bedridden, but the family stories are he was still writing his books. He did as much as he could even when he was in bed.
Frank Baum died in May 1919, a few days short of his 63rd birthday. But his greatest creation, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, would continue to be a sensation. In 1939, there were indications that America was finally coming out of a long economic depression. To boost confidence, a World's Fair was held in New York. The world of tomorrow was its theme. The war in Europe was becoming inevitable. Major powers, which would soon be on opposite sides, came to the fair. Through the toughest times, Hollywood produced movies which gave people hope that things would get better. Now it would get a helping hand from Frank Baum's Wizard.
Only MGM would have made The Wizard of Oz back in 1938-39. They were the only studio that had that kind of scope and class and determination to kind of shine and show off all their resources.
The movie is not a carbon copy of the book. I mean, that's not Hollywood style. They took a lot of liberties, they made a lot of changes, but I think they kept the spirit of the book, and I think that's the most important thing.
The spirit of Frank Baum's book was retained, but a key premise was not.
Unlike the movie, in the Oz books, Oz is a real place. The tornado actually takes Dorothy's house to Kansas. The shoes actually take her home at the end.
The story is very interested in the transformation of someone from one state of their life to another level. The transference of real characters into the fantasy sequence of the story was new for the film.
Frank Baum's idea was that a spiritual world exists alongside the physical one, and that Dorothy's journey could cross both. She and her friends were seeking something that they already had within themselves. and the purpose of their journey was to realize that.
He says the great author had a message to get across, and I was the instrument to deliver that message.
When producers paid the Baum family $40,000 for the film rights to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they were buying into Frank Baum's philosophy of life. Hollywood delivered his message as only it could.
A wonderful amalgamation of spectacle and comedy and melodrama. I mean, the forces of good versus the forces of evil, and incorporated into that is just an enormous number of theatrical genius was part of that.
The whole family would sit in the living room and watch it together and go through this dramatic roller coaster of emotions that it would take you, from sheer terror to, just heartrending sadness and longing. And then the next day it would be all anyone would talk about when you first came to school.
There's no place like home. There's no place.
When the script was first commissioned, a team of writers set out to adapt Frank Baum's story. Now preserved at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, this early draft, heavily notated by screenwriter Noel Langley, is evidence of the transformation the script went through.
Whenever they had a problem with the script, they went back to the book and solved it by seeing how L. Frank Baum had done it.
In Frank Baum's story, Dorothy's slippers are silver. In the movie, they are ruby red. And today, it's the ruby slippers and the journey they took that resonate for visitors from all over the world.
You can see people of different languages exchanging in front of the case with the ruby slippers. And perhaps they don't understand each other, but they're sharing that moment, and they're sharing that moment of memory.
The film was a turning point in cinema, in the same way that the book was in publishing in 1900. Just as Frank Baum and William Wallace Denslow used color as a storytelling device in their book, so did MGM.
There is no rainbow in Baum's book. That was, again, an MGM invention. It was E.Y. Harburg, the lyricist of the songs for The Wizard of Oz, who realized, okay, what would bring color to Dorothy's life? What would be the only thing in color that little girl would see in that gray existence? And he thought of a rainbow.
The rainbow was an extension of the movie's visual transition from black and white in Dorothy's real world to the vivid colors of Oz, which was made possible because of a new process called Technicolor.
Since the 1890s, it had been a goal of the motion picture industry to add color to the black and white films that they were producing. And so even in the 1890s, Edison and the Lumiere brothers were undertaking processes by which they hand-colored each frame of the film, but it was very painstaking. And so later on, there were attempts to tint or tone entire sections of a film for dramatic effect. And so Technicolor progressed over the years from 1915 to the time that this camera was produced in the 1930s.
This is one of the 9 cameras used in the making of MGM's Wizard of Oz. It was given to the National Museum of American History by the Technicolor Corporation.
Technicolor really did something for the Wizard of Oz, and the Wizard of Oz really did something for Technicolor.
A 35mm motion picture camera was modified to run 3 strips of black and white film at the same time. Each was shot through a different color filter: red, green, and blue. Combining them during processing produced brilliant colors. But to achieve its potential, Technicolor needed more light than ever before.
And so it required carbon arc lamps, which produced extremely intense light and could also be very expensive.
Lighting costs increased 4-fold, but that wasn't the only downside of Technicolor. In The Wizard of Oz, actors were made to suffer for their art in costumes which surpassed any Hollywood had ever produced.
Making Ray Bolger look like a scarecrow meant a rubberized mask that also looked like burlap on his face. No one had tried to make a fantasy this elaborate using real characters.
The costume designers and the set designers really did go a little crazy in producing the most vibrant and vivid colors they could in order to take full advantage of the process.
And as I move this over the shoe, you can see in an area like this that there's like a netting underneath the sequins, and it was just a normal shoe, and they put the netting over it to allow them to stitch the sequins into the piece.
Everything they did in Wizard of Oz had to be tested. There was a huge problem getting the yellow brick road to photograph yellow. They tried this kind of tinting and that kind of dye and that kind of lighting effect. And then somebody said, why don't you just get a bucket of yellow paint and use that? And there was the yellow brick road.
Frank Baum mixed science with magic in his stories. MGM did the same to create a defining moment in the film, the extreme weather event that he once wrote about when he lived in South Dakota.
The special effects, again, what a challenge. No computers, just what they could create out of the imagination of all these amazing artisans. They used a lot of dust, a lot of wind machines, a 35-foot-long muslin stocking from the top of a soundstage to a little car underneath so that the bottom of the tornado could move around the ground. And that is how they created a very, very realistic tornado.
The magic of Hollywood recreated Frank Baum's landscapes, but it was the cast that brought them to life.
The actors seem to be in on the illusion that they are creating. So therefore, they're not playing it just for the face value of the character, they're bringing their own persona to the roles.
The actors were well matched to the roles they portrayed. They brought with them the experience of vaudeville, a uniquely American musical and comedy tradition.
I love The Cowardly Lion. And I don't know how much it's the writing of the screenplay and how much of it is the work of Burt Lahr. But that's another instance where it's the perfect mating of performer and role.
The lion, the royal lion who's afraid, incorporated all his early vaudeville business, the dancing, the, put him up, that's all from his cop act in vaudeville. The fighting and all that you see in the film, that's all stuff he did years before, but all mannerisms fed into that role.
In 1939, the movie's underlying message would be embraced by people around the world.
So you have all that energy focused on telling a story to people who for over a decade, or just about a decade, had seen the collapse of capitalism, the collapse of most of their dreams, the change of what they thought was going to be the trajectory of their lives. Behind all that was the thunder of things happening in Europe and perhaps the possibility of going to war.
We'd been through one world war. We were getting ready to go into another one. The world had changed a lot. So I think the question of sort of where's home base? Where are we? How do we get back to what's important to us? How do we discover who we are? And that story marks that journey.
3 weeks after the film's release, war was declared in Europe. And in 1941, America entered the war, as did the music from The Wizard of Oz.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's
I don't think anybody realized at the time that Over the Rainbow would be the success that it was. I think Judy knew it was a beautiful song, but it wasn't until World War II when she started going around to sing to the troops, and she found that her most requested song was Over the Rainbow.
And as the world went to war, Over the Rainbow became a perfect fit with the times and gave many hope for the future, while another memorable song, We're Off to See the Wizard, would rally the troops.
Winston Churchill mentions in his memoirs that The Wizard of Oz was so popular in Australia that the troops went into combat singing the song from Wizard of Oz as they went into battle.
little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow. Why, oh, why can't
Frank Baum set out to write the first genuine American fairy tale to give pleasure to children. Today, wherever people gather to read his books, to see the movie, or visit places where fragments of American memory are preserved, Frank Baum and his wonderful Wizard of Oz will be remembered for showing others the way back home.
It's quite an honor. You know, I feel quite honored to be in this family in this way at this time. And quite fantastic that 100 years later, it's still, 110 years later, it's still quite popular and dynamic, and people are really touched by it. It's amazing.